Okay. So thank you for coming. Do you need an introduction, or do you know me? We know you. Yeah, of course we know. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, then I'll remain anonymous tonight. Okay, so thanks for coming. So this series is some great moments in medicine, and the problem with such a topic is that one gets to choose one's own favorite topics, and that's problematic. I understand, because many of you might not agree with the choice, but I'll tell you along the way why I chose them. But it all started, my interest began when I was in Oxford a few years ago, and I picked up this book, Medicine's 10 Greatest Discoveries. And the authors were Mayer Friedman and Friedland. Now, one of the reasons that got me really interested was because Friedland was born in Pretoria, South Africa, and then went on to become Professor Emeritus of Radiology at Stanford. So that got me interested, and I looked at the topics, and I found that some of them interested me and others didn't. So Friedman was an American cardiologist who developed the theory with the type A behavior of chronically angry and impatient people raising their risk of heart attacks. Sorry, they want the lights. Okay. And Freedland, who was at Stanford, the South African who was at Stanford, has had a very illustrious career, written many articles, book chapters. He was chief of radiology at Palo Alto, and he had the Gerald W. Friedland Learning Center named in his honor. He organized the first pioneering Women in Medicine conference, and he had the foresight to promote vegan diets, exercise, and type B behavior before they gained popularity. So, this book has 10 chapters. Now you'll see that I've got some in italics here. So I have chosen the ones in italics. I'm going to cover those. Andreas Vesalius and the Modern Human Anatomy, which is particularly important because without it we wouldn't have progressed. And then William Harvey and the circulation of blood. Now what happens is a lot of people can't decide between these two as to what were the two greatest achievements in medicine. Okay? Then there was Anthony Leeuwenhoek and bacteria, Jenner and vaccination, which are very important, but you can't cover everything. And then I've chosen Crawford Long and surgical anesthesia because I've had surgery a few times and it's always struck me as to what would it be like if we had no anesthetics. And then Röntgen and the X-ray beam, Ross Harrison and tissue culture, those are experimental. Nikolai Anichkov and cholesterol, which became a big story. Fleming and antibiotics is very good. And Morris Wilkins and DNA, I've chosen but not exactly talking too much about Wilkins as about the others. Okay, so the other source I've used for my genetics talk is this book. Have you read it? The Double Helix. It's one of the finest reads. I mean, this man, James Watson, who was one of the founders of the structure of the DNA molecule, who was one of the most arrogant and egotistical people you can find in the scientific world, wrote this book. But it's particularly interesting because it gives you the story about the discovery of the DNA structure, and at the same time it tells you so much about Watson. And then this was a lovely book for which I paid all of $1 American. In fact, the postage was far more than the cost of the book. The Eighth Day of Creation by Horace Freeland Judson, who was a columnist. He is late now, and he's written this tome, but he's covered almost every aspect of the birth of molecular biology. Can you hear me? All of you? Okay. Now, So, I just wanted to tell you about something that happened to me, and that was I was in London with my wife, and we went to the West End, and I was absolutely thrilled that there was a play called Photograph 51, and it was about the life of Rosalind Franklin. Now, what worries me about the book that I used as original source is that not a single woman was covered. And there were many great women in medical history. And one of them was Rosalind Franklin. Now, I haven't read The Dark Lady of DNA, but there was this play there in the West End called Photograph 51, and Nicole Kidman was acting as Rosalind Franklin. But the starting prices were £60. And you can imagine what that would work out in our exchange rate. So, that's the first one. And then for the talk on epigenetics, I've chosen The Epigenetics Revolution by Nessa Carey. She's a British biologist working in the field of molecular biology and biotechnology. She is the International Director of the Technology Transfer Organization at Praxis Unico and a visiting professor at Imperial College London. This book was given to me by my friend over there, Dot, and it's an absolutely brilliant read about epigenetics, which we will talk about, I think, on Wednesday. It's the 21st century science, epigenetics. Okay? Now, so this book, the other reason why I liked it is that it was on the back jacket. It said, this is a highly readable, fascinating and instructive book, highly recommended as a rewarding and pleasurable reading experience to all who have an interest in medicine and to all others who have an interest in the intellectual process of developing new knowledge. Michael E. DeBakey. Have you heard of him? Who has? Okay. Now, Michael DeBakey, let me tell you, so again, this is my high school experience, and again, with a friend whose parents were rich enough to buy him every magazine. And Life magazine was one of them. And you remember Life, it had those beautiful photographs. And he was paging through it, and I was he was a bit selfish, he didn't want me to see what he was reading. But I sort of peeped in, and I saw the surgeon and a picture of a heart, and this surgeon was actually doing an operation. I think I must have been in grade 8 or 9. But I was so fascinated by this, I got his name, and I followed him ever since. And he died a few years ago. And he had invented the first heart valve, synthetic heart valve, made of Teflon. And he was going to use it. He was in Houston, Texas. He was going to use it on a patient, and he went to a medical conference. And when he came back, he heard that one of his consultants had used his heart valve in an operation. And that consultant's name was Denton E. Cooley. And he threw Denton Cooley out of his hospital. And he says, get out of here and don't ever come back. So Denton Cooley went across the road and he built an equally formidable heart center. And they competed with each other. They never spoke. They saw each other at overseas conferences. They had nothing to do with each other across the road in Houston, Texas. And when DeBakey was dying, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, Denton Cooley went to seek his forgiveness. This is quite a story. But DeBakey was the man who was called when the king of Saudi Arabia was having a heart problem, when the Shah of Iran needed heart surgery, when Boris Yeltsin needed heart surgery. It was Michael DeBakey who was called out. But not a nice man, not a pleasant man. And he came to South Africa after the heart transplant. And this was a picture in the New York Times taken with him and Chris Barnard. Nicholas, here's your Chris Barnard. And this other man here, Adrian Kranovitz, these are such interesting stories about this rush to perform the world's first heart transplant. Apparently, in Kranovitz's case, he got up early one Sunday morning in 1967. He had a bad night because his daughter had gone night clubbing. and he was very, very worried about her safety. So when he heard the door open and shut in the early hours of the morning, and she had put on the kettle, and he walked quite drowsy into the kitchen, and he asked her, "Are you all right?" And she said, "I'm fine, Dad. Oh, by the way, while I was coming here, I heard the news that somebody in a place called Cape Town performed a heart transplant. And this man, he could have fallen in a heap. They say he spent the rest of the day walking the streets of New York, telling him, because he was almost ready to do one." And then on the other end, this was in New York, on the other end, on the West Coast, was another Norman Shumway, who was also ready. They had done so much research, and they were just waiting for a patient to do the heart transplant. Shumway never, ever forgave Barnard. In fact, one of my colleagues said she went to an international conference about 8 or 9 years ago when Shumway was still alive, and he spoke on the history of transplantation. He was the main speaker, and he barely mentioned Barnard. And Barnard did the world's first heart transplant. Now, the latest book about Barnard is this one called Heartbreaker. And it's a worthwhile read, okay? But, you know, Barnard's name in post-apartheid South Africa has become intertwined with the name of Hamilton Naki. Have you heard of him? Okay, so Hamilton Naki worked in the J.S. Murray laboratory in our department. I knew him extremely well. And at the time we worked together, the head of the department was, the head of that lab was Professor Rosemary Hickman. So now, what actually happened is Naki was walking past the lab one day many, many years ago. He used to work at the UCT tennis courts. And there was an American surgeon who popped his head out and saw Mr. Naki and said, "I need some help with putting an animal onto the table." And Mr. Naki apparently walked into the lab. I've heard this story told many times before, and helped this man. And then he stayed to watch whatever procedure this man, Robert Goots of Chicago, I think he was performing. And Naki liked it, and he said to Robert Goots, "Can't I work here?" And he said, "Yes, you can." And it wasn't very long before Naki was able to administer an anaesthetic to the animals. And it wasn't very long before that when he started performing the operations. And my personal experience with Hamilton Naki is when I came to the department in 1980, I was told by Rosemary Hickman, "Go down to the lab and meet Hamilton Naki." So I went to the lab and I was told that I couldn't walk in, I had to put on a surgical gown. And then I walked into the animal theatre, and there was Mr. Naki there, and there was another doctor, there was a doctor on the other side of the table, and clearly they were doing an operation. And Naki looked up and he saw me, he said, "Yes, my boy, what can I do for you?" But he knew I was coming. He was pretending he didn't know me, right? So he said, come and stand here, come and watch. And I went and stood next to him, and then he taps that other doctor on the hand and says, "I asked you not to put the clamp there. Put the clamp here." Now I thought Naki was the assistant and the doctor was doing the operation, but it turned out that Naki was probably showing him the procedure. And he had no formal education beyond Standard 6. And he lived in Langa in a hostel. One room, with a primer stove and shared bathroom and communal facilities. That was Hamilton Naki. And when people asked him, you know, the UCT gave him an honorary master's, and at that honorary master's, his citation was read out by one of our very senior and very excellent breast cancer surgeons, David Dent, who's now retired. He said, "Mr. Hamilton Naki was to teach them the craft of surgery in a research laboratory. I well remember during liver transplant experiments, 2 enormous gloved hands would descend into the abdomen and then with exquisite delicacy and accuracy join the minute blood vessels together. This procedure is called the anastomosis. When asked how he had learned all the surgical skills he had without formal training, he smiled and said quietly, "I stole with my eyes." This university honors a man who taught the craft of surgery to so many. Mr. Hamilton Naki, an extraordinary teacher and surgical craftsman. Chancellor, I have the honor to invite you to confer the degree of Master of Medicine honoris causa upon Mr. Hamilton Naki. Right? This made world headlines. Now, the late Bongani Mayose, who was a very close friend of mine and a neighbor in the corridor, asked me after Hamilton Naki had died, wouldn't you write something about Mr. Naki? Right? And so I wrote a piece in the South African Medical Journal, and we called it Hamilton Naki, a Surgical Sherpa. And this is still being read today worldwide. It's become an article that people refer to. But something happened which was not very pleasant. When Professor Barnard was once interviewed about Hamilton Naki, he said, "I couldn't have done without him. In fact, his surgical skills are better than mine." Now, I'm paraphrasing this, but the statement was made. Okay? Now, when Hamilton Naki died, the obituaries in all the world's major newspapers, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Telegraph, the Washington Post, the Economist, all said that Hamilton Naki assisted Chris Barnard in the world's first heart transplant. Now that put UCT into a very difficult position. Because if UCT said, yes, he did, then the question is, how can you allow a non-qualified doctor to be part of such a momentous, he shouldn't be a part of any surgery on humans. He was a laboratory technician. And if UCT said, no, he wasn't, then there was the question of race. Are you hiding something because he was not white? So it was a catch-22 situation for UCT. So this man, Michael Cotton, contacted me and he said that somebody in the British Royal Society has commissioned him to do an article in Hamilton Naki, and would I not, and he had read mine in the South African Medical Journal, and would I be interested in joining him? And that created quite an uproar in the department, because the professors there said to me, you got to be careful, my colleague said to me, because if something wrong is said again, it's going to put UCT in a bad light. So I said to him, I will be a co-author if you allow Professor Rosemary Hickman, the lab manager, to be one of the co-authors, and that you do not publish until we're fully satisfied that you've got the facts right. So we wrote this piece, Michael Cotton, Rosemary Hickman, and myself, Hamilton Naki, his life and his role in the first heart transplant. And it was published in the Annals of the Royal College of Surgery in England. Now, this controversy became so bad, that I think, in a way, it compromised Mr. Naki's legacy and the contributions he's made to surgery in Cape Town and the continent. And it was extremely unfortunate because UCT had to get the major newspapers in the world to withdraw that obituary and make a correction and say that Mr. Naki was nowhere near Denise Darwell or Louis Washkansky or Chris Barnard on the night of the surgery. And in various books, like the book by Marius Barnard called Defining Moments, written just before he died, he also mentions there that Hamilton Naki was certainly not in the hospital that evening. Okay? And then, as I said, there are no women. Although all 10 of the investigators were married and most had children, it was their mistresses whom they passionately loved, and that mistress was the work. Most sought fame and prestige, but not money. Most were young during the discovery, an average age of 32 years. In fact, Vesalius, Long, and Anichkov were in their 20s. and only Röntgen was 50 years old. Okay? They didn't mention my favorite scientist, my most favorite scientist, Marie Curie, whom I spoke about recently in the biography section. Okay? And I said they didn't mention Rosalind Franklin. There's some very interesting story around her in the discovery of the structure of DNA, which we'll talk about later. And then there were some basic contributions, but being basic doesn't mean that they were not momentous. And one of them was by this man, Ignaz Semmelweis, and he seems to be forgotten. He lived in between 1818 and 1865. He demonstrated that the incidence of puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, could be drastically reduced by appropriate hand washing by medical caregivers. That sounds very mundane, but it is so important. This could be the beginning of sterility. He made this discovery in 1847 while working in the maternity department of the Vienna Lying-in Hospital. And there's a statue of him at the University of Tehran, of all places. Okay? So he excluded overcrowding as a cause of the fever. Okay? Since the second clinic was always more crowded and the mortality was lower. He eliminated climate as a cause because climate was the same. Okay? And then in 1847 he made a breakthrough when he was watching students doing autopsies, and he realized that they didn't wash their hands when they finish. And so he developed what we call the germ theory of disease. And most of you would know that surgery, today's surgery is such a well-established craft. I have been in the Department of Surgery for 40 years, right? I've watched some of the most brilliant surgeons performing their craft. And most of the operations, no matter how major, are successful. But people die after surgery. They get septicemia because hospital environments have germs. So the germ theory of disease had not yet been accepted in Vienna. Okay? Semmelweis concluded some unknown cadaverous material caused childbed fever. So he instituted a policy of using a solution of chlorinated lime for washing hands between autopsy work and the examination of patients. And the results were absolutely staggering. He found that puerperal fever actually went down in these clinics if hand washing became a practice, which is very, very fantastic. Okay? Then they didn't mention any South Africans, although one of the authors of this, or editors of this book, was South African. They didn't mention people like Aaron Klug. His three-dimensional images of bodily molecules won a Nobel Prize. He was educated at WITS and UCT, and although he was a chemist, right, he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1982 for devising ways to create three-dimensional images of biological molecules like proteins and DNA. And he died on November the 20th. He was 92. He had later, after his Nobel Prize, he had a particular interest in Alzheimer's disease. So he went to Cambridge and he worked there. He wasn't mentioned. Neither was Sidney Brenner. Sidney Brenner has made some amazing contributions to modern medicine. He won the Nobel Prize in 2002 in molecular biology. He was educated at WITS University. He studied medicine there. He proposed the theory of messenger RNA, which I'll tell you about tomorrow, as an intermediary between DNA and protein. Okay? And he actually describes the process, but we'll go into detail tomorrow. And he used a worm called C. elegans as a model organism to study organ development and apoptosis. Apoptosis means cell suicide. When we're developing in our mother's wombs, sometimes there's an excess of cells which need to be rid of, otherwise you get terrible conditions like hair lips and things like that. And those cells then commit suicide, and that process is called apoptosis. Okay? I don't know how many of you know, but Alan MacLeod Cormack was a South African physicist, who eventually went to America, who won the 1979 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on X-ray computed tomography. That means the CT scanner was built on the theories that he propounded. So he was a UCT student. And there was a book written about him by Kit Vaughan. Professor Kit Vaughan was the head of biomedical engineering here at UCT. Okay? Now, this idea about Western medicine, I just want to raise this. Remember, this is an introductory talk and I'm just setting the scene. And so I want to raise some of these points. So this man, Roy Porter, a British historian, known for his important work on the history of medicine. Now, he was at University College. His book is available in the library. I got it out of the medical library. He says Western medicine has developed in ways which have made it uniquely powerful and led it to become uniquely global. It spread throughout the world and has developed in ways which have made it uniquely powerful and led it to become uniquely global. Its ceaseless spread throughout the world owes much, doubtless, to Western political and economic domination. It is perceived by the sick to work uniquely well, at least for major classes of disorders. It may be, and I don't know whether this was a tongue-in-cheek remark, it may be that one day shamanistic, Ayurvedic, Chinese and traditional medicine will become dominant, but not now. So, right. So now, he says in favor of Western medicine that in Europe, from Greco-Roman antiquity onwards, and also among the great Asian civilizations, the medical profession systematically replaced transcendental explanations by positing a natural basis for disease and healing, which I agree with. The body was viewed as integral to law-governed cosmic elements and regular processes. Greek medicine stressed the microcosm-macrocosm relationship, a healthy body in tune with the harmonies of nature. From Hippocrates in the 5th century BC to Galen in the 2nd century AD, humoral medicine stressed the analogies between the 4 elements of external nature, fire, water, air, and earth, and the 4 humors or bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile, whose balance determined health. I mean, these were all ideas that contributed to us getting where we are today. Parallels to these views appeared in the classical Chinese and Indian medical traditions. Okay? Now, this scientific medicine was successful because it was grounded upon experimental anatomical and physiological investigation from the 15th century. That is the strength of Western medicine. Experimentation and evidence. Okay? So, take Galen of Pergamon. 2nd century, was a Greek physician, surgeon and philosopher. And then the great William Harvey, who we'll talk about on Friday, was an English physician who made seminal contributions in anatomy and physiology. Harvey is regarded as the man who did the first experiments in medicine with corpses. And he had evidence for what he was saying. He was the first known physician to describe completely and in detail the systematic circulation. He published De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543. That was by the Paduan Professor Andreas Vesalius, a momentous anatomical atlas and a work which challenged the truths since Galen. So Galen was in the 2nd century. Here comes Andreas Vesalius in 1543, followed by Harvey's De Mortu Cordis in 1628, which put physiological inquiry on the map by experiments demonstrating the circulation of blood and the heart's role as a pump. And then in the 18th and 19th century, people began to work on the brain and nervous system. In the 19th century, the microscope came about and studies of body tissue and pioneering cell biology and the study of infectious diseases. And then there were parallel developments in organic chemistry, gave a better understanding of respiration, nutrition, the digestive and endocrine systems. And now in the 20th and the 21st century, it's genetics and molecular biology. That's how far we've come with Western medicine. It's been absolutely fantastic. And it's been a long and winding road, but it's been worth it. Okay? Now, but now my problem with that is, while we focus on Western medicine, we give the impression that nobody else made any contributions to knowledge today. And it's Mike Bruton always calls this a well-kept secret. And in this book, William F. Bynum, A Little History of Science, he talks about the Islamic or the Arabic contribution to medicine. Muhammad of Islam, he introduced Islam, he lived between 570 and 632. Now, many people don't know this about Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. He actually said that to study nature is worth more than 1,000 nights of prayer. To seek knowledge, go unto China. Muhammad was a man who was all for education and learning. And many people look at the Muslim world today and say, but there's no sign of it. But Muhammad was the one who actually started the idea. So, the Islamic Empire dominated the Middle East, North Africa, and moved as far as Spain and East Asia, but centered in Baghdad, where there was a house of wisdom. Muslims studied Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and translated manuscripts from Greek and Latin into Middle Eastern languages, or they would have been lost. Without Islamic scholars, we wouldn't know half as much as we do about our scientific ancestors. It was the Muslim translations, Bynum says, that formed the foundation of European science and philosophy after about 1100. And medicine, more than any other Islamic science, had the greatest impact on European thinking. Al-Razi, 1854 to 925, wrote important works in medicine and left accurate descriptions of smallpox, distinguishing it from measles. Avicenna, also called Ibn Sina, 980 to 1037, was the most important Islamic doctor. But I've noticed now, paging through the British newspapers over the last few years, they are sort of having profiles, The Independent, The Guardian, having profiles of Muslim scientists. But in this book, Jim al-Khalili, who wrote The Pathfinders, The Golden Age of Arabic Science, he's a British theoretical physicist, he's an author and a broadcaster. He's Professor of Theoretical Physics and Chair in the Public Engagement in Science at the University of Surrey. He did a BBC documentary on science and Islam, and it was a very comprehensive job. Okay? But if people ask, so if the Arabs contributed so much to medicine, what was the problem? Why didn't they continue? So, according to Tamim Ansari, in this book, Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes, he says after Muhammad died in 632 AD, philosophers turned their attention to matters of the cosmos with the aim of relating findings to what was in the Holy Quran. Now, if you know a bit of Muslim history, the Quran was thought to be a revelation from God to the Muslims or to the Arabs via Muhammad. Muhammad was the conduit, okay? Now, when philosophers said, well, now Muhammad is gone, we know the Quran, but let's look at the cosmos and see how it relates to what he said in the Quran. This was opposed by the scholars. And the scholars are the people that we call imams today in a modern sense, who would not allow any inquiry into the natural world without reference to scripture. Despite this, great strides were made during the golden age of Arabic science. However, the resistance to disentangle scientific inquiry from revelation cost the Muslims dearly. And the experiences of people like Pervez Hoodboy, who is a physicist, he's an internationally renowned physicist at Quad-i-Azam University in Pakistan. And he had an experience one day. He was teaching a class and telling them about the mechanics of an earthquake, because it was about the time that Iran was hit by an earthquake. And while he was explaining it, these young people in the class stood up and objected and said, no, all this is nonsense. God created that earthquake in Iran because the Iranians have been, they've been immoral. And Hoodboy was horrified. And he said, this is a mindset that we have to address, right? And we have to keep science and religion separate. And I've spoken about that on many platforms. So he says in his book, Islam and science have parted ways. Now, Edward Wilson, my favorite biologist, do you mind if I had some water? My favorite biologist believes that Western science and medicine have been successful. Firstly, because you don't separate research from clinical medicine anymore. There's a consilience. You join them. There's a consilience between physics, chemistry, and biology. They joined. They're now integrated. Western science and medicine took the lead because it cultivated reductionism and physical law to expand the understanding of space and time beyond that attainable by the unaided senses. In this book, Consilience, which I talk about every time I give a talk, the opening line is, I can remember the day I dreamed about unified learning. In fact, Wilson's later books, he suggests that this divide between science and the humanities is not going to take humanity forward. We have to combine the two and have consilience. Now, he believes that reductionism is the thing that was... Oh dear, what happened here? Okay. So reductionism means that if you take any object, any piece of matter in the universe, whether it's one of you or your jerseys or your watches or this table, and if you break it down to an irreducible point, you'll get atoms. So all matter is made of atoms. So it's from atoms that you got molecules, cells, organs, organ systems, organism, mind and consciousness, and then society and culture. So Steven Weinberg, the famous cosmologist, says the explanatory arrow always points downwards. Everything can be reduced to atoms or physics. The more we comprehend the universe, the more pointless and meaningless it seems. But that's his opinion. Okay, so reductionism, Wilson says, is the best way to construct knowledge of the physical world. And it was not easy to grasp at the dawn of science. Now, the reason why Westerners progressed so fast compared to the Easterners was that the Chinese scholars never achieved it, never achieved reductionism, despite their high intellectual ability. The Chinese, despite being isolated, acquired scientific information as rapidly as did the Arabs, who had all the Greek knowledge as a launching ramp. But between the 1st and the 13th centuries, Chinese and 8th to the 12th centuries Arabs led Europe by a wide margin. But the Easterners were different in the approach. Okay? The Chinese, their focus stayed on holistic properties and onto harmonious, hierarchical relationships of entities, from stars down to mountains and flowers and sand, says Joseph Needham, right? So they didn't want to break things down to see what the building blocks are. They wanted to see the harmony between species and within species. So in this world view, the entities of nature are inseparable and perpetually changing, not discrete and constant as perceived by Enlightenment thinkers. Now, there was a chap by the name of Alan Watts. I don't know, he wrote some very interesting books. He said things like, you and the cow are not separate, but a living continuity. Now, Western scientists will say, no, they're in two different classes, and we have to see them as such, and we have to define them, and then decide on how we actually study them. Most traditional systems sought to understand the relations of the sick person to the wider cosmos and to make the readjustment between the individual and the world. Western medical tradition explains sickness in terms of the body itself, its own cosmos. Modern Western medicine is indifferent to the cosmos, supernatural ancestors, and anything transcendental. Okay? So, and then there's traditional medical practices. They are largely an oral history. Sickness, they think, can be caused by ill will, curses, malevolent spirits, sorcery, witchcraft, and diabolical or divine intervention. Some religious sects view sickness in providential and supernatural terms. Healing shrines, like Lourdes, remain popular within the Roman Catholic Church. Faith healing for devotees of TV evangelists in the USA is a big thing. Acupuncture and Ayurvedic, I've got a question mark there because some people swear by them. Which of these breakthrough achievements was the most important? William Harvey's elucidation of the functions of the heart and the circulation of blood in the human body, because he introduced the principle of experimentation and evidence finding for the first time in medicine. He also recognized that the body and its parts moved, that life itself was a series of movements. So, who was the runner-up in this book? This is now according to the authors. Theirs was a tough decision between Harvey and Andreas Vesalius. Okay? For his accurate description of the tissues and organs of the human body. That was Vesalius. But Harvey's discovery initiated the field of physiology as we know it. And his finding that blood traveled in a circle had to be not only the greatest discovery of Western medicine, but also the greatest medical achievement of all time. Now, I've read this elsewhere too, so it's not only the opinion of these authors, okay? But I haven't dedicated a talk to Vesalius, so I thought I'll tell you something about him. So he lived between 1514 and 1564, and he wrote this brilliant book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem, right? And for short we call it Fabrica in 1543. Sir William Osler called it the greatest medical book ever to appear. He said this was the birth of modern medicine. So Vesalius was a 16th century Flemish anatomist, a physician, and author of one of the most influential books on human anatomy, the Fabrica. He's often referred to as the founder of modern human anatomy. He was born in Brussels, okay? And there's the book. And the illustrations in the book. He was a man who loved bones. He always, I'll tell you more about him just now. When he got the bones, he put them all together. And the way he described them, they haven't changed. It hasn't changed. Nobody needed to change. Okay? Now, he was obsessively curious about bones, without which we would have been blobs with no mobility and function. Okay? He risked attack by wild dogs in cemeteries to find bones. He was a grave robber. So he used to send out a message to his students, somebody is dying, keep an eye on him, and check out where they bury him, so tonight we'll go and fetch his body. Okay? Now, so it initiated medical science itself, this book. It presented medicine with the precious gift of the scientific method with which to approach an infinite number of future medical problems. Many of the tools medical science would later employ were first developed in this revolutionary book. The complete absence of numinous in any investigation, the straightforward and unemotional prose, the exact illustration, the pitiless savagery of vivisection, the need to establish priority of discovery, and the formulation of generalizations by alignment of individual observations. Now, there were others, okay? There was Herophilus of Alexandria in the 4th century BC who dissected some corpses. He was a Greek physician. He was the first anatomist, but all his work was lost in a fire. And then Galen. Now this is very interesting. Galen was the man of the 2nd century who really started it all. And he was better known as Galen of Pergamon. He was a Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher in the Roman Empire. His word was gospel. To criticize or correct it was a life-endangering heresy. You were not allowed to criticize Galen. He worked on animals, not humans. Nothing happened for centuries until the 16th. Can you believe it? Galen's word was so strong, it was like gospel, that after the 2nd century, until the 16th, nobody made any changes to anatomy. Nothing happened for centuries. A universal prohibition on the dissection of human corpses. We were told don't dissect corpses, go and read Galen. Okay? But nearer the Renaissance, there was a man by the name of Modino di Luzzi of Bologna who wrote this Anatomia, right? He described dissections of the human body. Now, Galen's errors started becoming visible. He said the spleen empties into the stomach. He was wrong. He said the liver was 5-lobed. He was wrong. He said the heart had 3 ventricles and the uterus had multiple segments. And everybody was too scared to counter Galen. Okay? But nearer the Renaissance, another man, DeBakey, head of surgery and anatomy at Bologna, published commentaries on the Anatomia. He corrected Galen's wrong ideas. Do you appreciate how science marches forward? Even when people are scared for their lives, the truth will eventually out. The science of human anatomy was about to be born. Okay? And then comes Vesalius. He had a medical degree from Padua. He was a court physician to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And Charles V abdicated in 1556, and Vesalius then attended to Charles's successor, his son Philip II. Okay, now, this was the time of great upheaval in Europe. Martin Luther had posted his 69 Theses on the door of the church at Wittenberg, and the Protestant faith was born. And at the Diet of Worms, Luther had to face the wrath of Charles V. This was the Diet at Worms in 1521, when Luther said to Charles, I will not recant. So it was at that time. Now, Vesalius was a medical student. He started by robbing graves, right? And he risked attacks. He begged judges to stay and execution so he could get the body. He divulged illnesses of teachers to students. Be ready for the body. Or he gave them the locations of the graves. He kept bodies in his rooms. He was very enthusiastic. He was cold-hearted, determined, an extraordinarily ambitious man. He became a doctor in 1539 at the age of 23, and soon after the head of department of surgery and anatomy at Padua. Okay? He construed the body as Galen had described it in the 2nd century. Then in this book he pointed out Galen's errors 14th century later. Okay? In this book here, Tabulae Anatomicae Sex. He differed from his predecessors who sat and read Galen while a barber did the dissections. It was his fervent belief that for a person to know the human body, that person must dissect it. Get your hands dirty. There was no sense of sterility at that time. So you can imagine. And here he is giving a demonstration. No gloves, no surgical gown, no scrubbing up, and everybody was there. Some of them just couldn't bear it. I suppose the stench was too much. And then he carried on teaching. Okay. But his teacher, one of his teachers, Jacob Sylvius, Vesalius' anatomy teacher and leading anatomist in Europe, he said, I implore, he read Vesalius' book where Vesalius had attacked Galen. He said, I implore His Imperial Majesty to punish severely, as he deserves, this monster born and bred in his own house, this worst example of ignorance, ingratitude, arrogance, and impiety, to suppress him so that he may not poison the rest of Europe with his pestilential breath. How dare he criticize Galen? Okay? And Vesalius' successors, right? So Vesalius gave it all up at the age of 29. Can you believe it? He went and became a court physician. Then he was followed by a man called Rialdo Colombo, who we'll talk about, who worked closely just before Harvey. Rialdo Colombo succeeded Vesalius at Padua. He gave an accurate description of blood circulation from right to left ventricle of the heart via lungs. So now you can see what's happening, that people are actually dissecting and studying the body. He was hated by Vesalius because he said Vesalius's tongue and eye description were those of an ox and not a human being. Okay? And then Fallopius, after whom was named the fallopian tube, and Bartholomew Eustachius, after whom was named the Eustachian tube in the ear. Fallopius gave names to the vagina, the placenta, and the clitoris, and Eustachius further improved on Fabrica. Okay? And Vesalius said, I could have done nothing more worthwhile than to give a new description of the whole human body, of which nobody understood the anatomy, while Galen, despite his extensive writings, had offered very little on the subject. And I don't see how I could have presented my efforts to the students differently. And then comes William Harvey, whom we're going to talk about on Friday. He had an extreme and broad curiosity. Outside his field, his interests were in the origin and function of megalithic Stonehenge, where he did excavations at the base of the ancient stones. He was also interested in the embryological development of various animals, a trait that led to his meticulous dissections of various species. We'll talk about him on Friday. He took his wife's parrot and he dissected it. Okay, what will the 21st century bring? A cure for cancer? Schizophrenia and manic depressive syndrome? I know the neurosciences are growing from strength to strength, and I think epigenetics has a few surprises for us. But my boss says stop. Thank you. Could you hear me? I could feel an echo here. Is it okay? Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Any discussion? Any points to make? Yes, Doctor.
In the heart transplant area, before Respondent did the transplant, they did research in a little lab next to the postmortem room. And this is where Mr. Naki was with Professor Anwar. But what I'm just going to say is that he did a transplant of a dog's head onto another dog. And they named it Canis bicapitis. And the dog actually survived. And it made difficulty, sounds of difficulty. But there is a picture of that particular episode. And it's published in Younger, which is the student's medical magazine. This is about 1960.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to say is that during the medieval era, many of the doctors or students of England went to study medicine in
Cordoba.
In
Spain.
And Toledo, where the medical faculties were of the best. And when they returned, the Archbishop of Canterbury was very upset because the patients were complaining that the doctors could speak better Arabic than English. So it's the same thing here when we have the Cuban doctors.
Well, thank you for that. That story about the dog, Barnard and my former boss, John Tablanche, were involved in that operation. I heard about it. There was a man, I think his name was Cooper, in Cleveland, Ohio, who attempted a brain transplant on a dog. Yes, they did all these weird things. But today, they won't get away with it. Animal research is sort of fading out, you know. So, yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so they had the dog had two heads, yeah.